Yeah, thanks, Sarah. So I'm here today to talk to you about floodplains and really their modern sense and why we think that they might matter. So to start off, just want to start with a few definitions so we're kind of all on the same page. When I'm talking about rivers, I'm often talking about the river corridor or the riverscape, which might be another term that you've heard. But here, oftentimes when we're thinking about rivers, we think about their active channels, but the river corridor goes beyond that to include both the active channels as well as all the other landforms that were created under the current hydrologic regime. So that includes the floodplain, riparian zones, even the shallow hyporheic zone. And we really care about this river corridor because this is a place of habitat for a variety of aquatic and terrestrial species, also places of storage of water, sediment, organic material. And partly because of that storage, there are also areas of human activity such as agriculture. And so really a lot of function that we assign to these river corridors. Another term I'm going to talk about quite a bit is this idea of geomorphic heterogeneity. And here I'm defining geomorphic heterogeneity as the size and variety of geomorphic units, where a geomorphic unit is just a feature on the landscape formed by a given set of processes. So you can think about a point bar versus an actual floodplain surface versus the active channel. And we can take river corridors like this schematic off to the right and classify them by the geomorphic units that are present there. And we can define these geomorphic units based on the topography, the grain size, even the type and age of vegetation, which can tell us about the processes that help create that geomorphic unit. So while we're mapping form, we're really seeing this as a reflection of what's creating this floodplain. What's also nice about these geomorphic units and geomorphic heterogeneity is that we can quantitatively assess it. So we can look at the number of units across the river corridor, we can look at the diversity of those units, we can look at how evenly spread they are across the river corridor, and we can place rivers on a spectrum of high to low heterogeneity. Now, not all rivers are going to be naturally highly heterogeneous, but typically those that are, we associate those with the functions, more of the functions that I mentioned on that previous slide. And so today I'm really going to be talking about what causes this geomorphic heterogeneity, where do we see more heterogeneous reaches, and why does that matter? What does heterogeneity actually do to river corridor function? So starting with this first question on causes, we do have some ideas of what causes heterogeneity. There's boundary conditions within our watersheds, such as climate and lithology, that are going to be influencing certain drivers, including inputs of water, sediment, organic material over time to our river corridors, as well as biotic factors, such as what is the active vegetation that's there, or ecosystem engineers like beavers, as well as like the valley form. What is the shape and size and grain size present within our river corridor? And all of these things can potentially influence the type and heterogeneity of geomorphic units that we would expect to see within a given river corridor. We often associate sort of all of these as being potential drivers, but really focusing in on these inputs over time as potentially being the largest driver, as what has been hypothesized in the past. And again, we can kind of place these river corridors on a spectrum of high to low heterogeneity. This whole idea around what drives heterogeneity, though, and particularly this emphasis on the inputs over time, has largely come from our research on perennial rivers and perennial floodplains. However, many of our floodplains, actually half of our floodplain area in North America, is associated with non-perennial streams. These are dry for at least part of the year. Sarah has probably told you a bit about non-perennial streams, but not even just in North America, but across the globe, they account for about 50% of our rivers by length. In North America, they also account for about 50% of our floodplain area. So quite a bit of our floodplain area might not be described by these perennial flow regimes. Non-perennial flow regimes tend to be flashier. We see differences in sort of the timing and the magnitude of inputs through time, the frequency and the magnitude of inputs through time to these floodplains and to these river corridors. And that could potentially influence how geomorphic heterogeneity forms and how it persists over time. So we're really interested in sort of filling this gap of how is geomorphic heterogeneity created in these non-perennial river corridors? And is it the same as in perennial river corridors? So to answer that question, I went out to about 30 river corridors across the Southwest, kind of focused in 3 regions across southern Utah, southern Arizona, including the Canyonlands region, the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument region, as well as Walnut Gulch Experimental Watershed in southern Arizona. And these images off to the right can show you that we're truly dealing with ephemeral streams. So these channels are dry except for following significant precipitation, which typically happens in the late summer during convective monsoonal rainstorms. So again, very, very non-perennial, that other end of the spectrum from perennial rivers. To map these geomorphic units, we first identified floodplains along some of these non-perennial streams. So looking for some area where we would have more than just one geomorphic unit, being the channel. So having some idea of being able to accumulate geomorphic units within that accommodation space. So step one was identifying these actual unconfined river corridors and getting a preliminary floodplain boundary. We then went out into the field and we conducted transect surveys across these river corridors, noting the location as well as the type of geomorphic unit that we were encountering. So here we can see sort of the boundaries of each of these geomorphic units that we found in the field. This tells us a lot about the geomorphic units we're finding, sort of again on those individual transects, but we want to know more. What is the actual units we're seeing across the entire river corridor? So to go from these transects to actual maps of geomorphic units, we use our transect information as well as aerial imagery. Here we're looking at the USDA NAEP program imagery, as well as digital elevation models. So 1 meter digital elevation models, which were available for all of our sites. And we combine those lines of evidence, the imagery, our surveys, as well as the elevation to actually map geomorphic units continuously across all of our river corridors. So we can then take these maps of geomorphic units and actually quantify their heterogeneity using a number of metrics from landscape ecology. So we looked at metrics such as patch density, which is very simple, just telling us the number of units per floodplain area. We also looked at Shannon's diversity index, which is telling us how many unique unit types there are within a given river corridor. So this is looking at the proportion of area that falls into one unit type compared to our entire unit types. And this is still going to be influenced by how large, how many unit types we actually have. So we also looked at Shannon's evenness index, which takes this diversity index and divides it by the number of unit types we actually have. So we can kind of think about how evenly spread our different units are across the river corridor. And off to the left, we're just looking at these different metrics by those three regions. And we can see that there's a lot of variability in these metrics, but overall, we see some commonality between regions. There's not necessarily significant differences in the heterogeneity between our regions. That said, we did see some significant differences with Shannon's diversity index, where river corridors and Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument are slightly more heterogeneous in that category than other rivers. And so for the rest of kind of this portion of the talk, I'm mostly going to be referring to the Shannon's diversity index, just because we see that inter and intra variability, watershed variability there. One thing to note is that we actually found that our heterogeneity, particularly Shannon's diversity index metrics, were pretty similar to perennial rivers. So we're seeing that these non-perennial river corridors are roughly as heterogeneous as perennial river corridors. This is a little more limited to studies that actually mapped sort of what is the similar size of floodplain and river corridor we're looking at, as well as using the same metrics and methods that we did. So not very many studies there as well, but we are seeing some similarities between perennial rivers and non-perennial rivers. So we wanted to understand what's driving this heterogeneity, what's driving this variability between river corridors. So we wanted to quantify some of those potential drivers, including valley form, inputs over time, and biotic factors. You'll notice that biotic factors are grayed out here, and that's because we actually use vegetation to tell us when we're moving from one unit to another in these dryland settings. And so because it's already baked into the way that we defined geomorphic units, we didn't actually look at vegetation as a potential driver of that. We know it's already in that classification. So instead, we're mostly focusing on elements of this valley form, as well as inputs over time that could be potentially driving variability in the heterogeneity that we're seeing in these river corridors. So some of those elements of valley form, we got average floodplain width for each of our river corridors. We also looked at drainage basin area to kind of think about where in the river corridor are we and how could that potentially be influencing our heterogeneity. And we also looked at the dominant grain size, so particularly focusing on this percent fines, kind of getting an average value for each floodplain. Valley form metrics were really easy to measure. We can go out in the field or look at those digitally. Inputs over time are fairly difficult. Many non-perennial streams are ungauged, and ours are no exception. So in the absence of having gauges that could tell us directly how much water, how much sediment, or how much organic material is coming to this reach through time, We looked at a number of proxies. So for example, we couldn't measure the amount of organic material coming through a reach over time, but we did see accumulations of large wood within our river corridors. And so we mapped the volume of those accumulations as a proxy for how much organic material could potentially be sourced or loaded to that river corridor. We also, again, didn't have information about sediment dynamics or flow in most of our sites, but instead we used the proxy of channel change through time, looking at both the change in channel area through time, as well as the change or the amount of overlap between years. And we really see that we really use this as a proxy because we assume that in these dryland settings where we don't have perennial flow, we're only going to see change in our river, in our active channel area whenever we have a flow. So that's going to give us some proxy for the frequency as well as the magnitude of those flows in between years. So looking at how these potential drivers are related to, again, Shannon's diversity index, we found quite a few significant relationships. Particularly, we found a very strong relationship with floodplain width, where our wider river corridors were more heterogeneous. We saw a greater diversity of units within those wider river corridors. We also see a somewhat weaker relationship with drainage area, which we associated that with just a slight increase in floodplain width as we move downstream as well. We also saw some correlations with these potential metrics of inputs over time, so really focusing on this channel change. And we saw that where channels were overlapping less, so we have more mobile channels, we saw more heterogeneous river corridors. So here, low channel overlap just means that that channel is moving around a lot more between years, which we associate with a greater frequency or magnitude of flooding. We also see that as that channel area percent changes or increases, we tend to also see more heterogeneous river corridors. And within these settings, we often witnessed or saw within aerial imagery that channel increase in channel area was often associated with channel widening, which again, we associate with a greater frequency or magnitude of flooding through time. So potentially seeing some influence of both these valley form characteristics as well as these potential inputs over time. So we used some statistical models to really see what is the most dominant driver of this heterogeneity. And so when we built these statistical models, we then selected them for the most important characteristics, and we found that floodplain width is statistically the most important. So when we see some relationship with these inputs over time, particularly with channel change, we're really seeing that that floodplain width is what's largely driving it. So this accommodation space to be able to create units is what's helping drive our heterogeneity within these river corridors. So that gets a little bit at the causes and also hopefully helps identify what geomorphic heterogeneity is to you a little bit more. But really wanting to dive into some of these questions around like, why does that matter? Why do we care that these are heterogeneous river corridors? And can we actually tie that to hydrogeomorphic function? And so one of the functions I'm going to really focus on today is this idea of flood attenuation. Now we know that when floods or high flows can come into reaches that have floodplains, that flow can spread out, that can interact with more of the topography, more roughness elements, that decreases the velocity. Overall, what that does to the hydrograph is that decreases our peak magnitude and delays that when that peak happens, so increases our lag time. We call that typically floodplain attenuation. So we're seeing because of that storage, that temporary storage of water out in the floodplain, we get these more less amplified peaks downstream, so that attenuated peak as we move downstream. Now, when we have reaches that don't necessarily have very much floodplain, we don't necessarily get that storage, and we can actually see flood peak amplification as we move downstream because we don't necessarily have access to those floodplains. Overall, we know that floodplain attenuation exists, but we don't really know why or what types of floodplains attenuate the best. And so one of the things that we were thinking is that potentially this heterogeneity could be a descriptor of floodplain attenuation and where we might see floodplain attenuation. So to test this, I'm moving to a site up in the Northeast that has experienced quite a bit of flooding, unlike many of my sites in the Southwest, which have been fairly dry lately. This is Otter Creek in Vermont. This is about a 74-kilometer stretch of river that we're looking at here. And what's nice about this stretch is that we have USGS gauges both at the upstream end, which is in Center Rutland, and this river moves north, as well as at the downstream end in Middlebury, Vermont. And within those 74 river kilometers between these two USGS gauges, we also have continuous discharge data from a 2D HEC-RAS model. So we have this hydrodynamic model that can tell us a lot about how water is flowing through this large reach in between these two USGS metrics. So this is great. We have a lot of information. What we typically see in Otter Creek is this attenuation of flows as they move downstream, which have historically been attributed to the fact that Otter Creek has quite a bit of floodplain area. So here we're looking at a couple of key high flows that have occurred within Otter Creek over the last few decades. And all of the hydrographs that are sort of this dark blue are the ones that are recorded at Rutland, and going into this light blue, which was recorded at Middlebury. And so as we're moving downstream, you can hopefully see both this decrease in magnitude as well as this increase in lag time, which is what we call this floodplain attenuation. So we chunked up this river into a series of reaches, which we identified by the heterogeneity that is present there. We were interested in how the heterogeneity within each reach was influencing the amount of attenuation we were seeing as we move from reach to reach. So we quantified this attenuation both as a change in discharge, thinking about changes in the magnitude of flooding, as well as a change in lag time. So when do we actually see that peak compared to the start of the storm? And when we look at sort of these different reaches on Otter Creek, here we have sort of just the reach number as well as the amount of attenuation. We see that most of these reaches are largely attenuating for these large storms that we pulled out of this model. However, some reaches are attenuating more than others, so providing that function of floodplain attenuation more than others. And again, we were interested in whether or not that's related to the floodplain heterogeneity present within those reaches. So then we went and we quantified the heterogeneity of floodplain heterogeneity using topographic information. So we were able to get the DEM, that same DEM we're using in the hydrodynamic model. Here, instead of manually delineating all of these units, because again, we have 74 kilometers of river, we used a automated workflow. It's been published, and using the elevation of the pixels around it will identify sort of what unit you're in out of 10 possible units. And so we adapted this for river corridors. This is built for pretty much the entire landscapes, but we adapted it to try to describe these river corridors. We were able to actually create these heterogeneity maps or these geomorphic unit maps, again, just using this more automated workflow. And this really helped save me from clicking for 72 kilometers down Otter Creek. We're able to really scale this up and get heterogeneity or geomorphic units at a much larger scale. So similar to the previous study, we also looked at a number of potential metrics of heterogeneity, which we again derived from landscape ecology. So some of these are familiar. We looked at patch density and Shannon's evenness index. We also were interested in the fraction of concavities. So how many floodplain channels and depressions do we have within each of those reaches? Largely because we assume that those depressions could potentially be an attenuating factor within this river corridor particularly. So we're just looking at the areas that are in sort of those units that would be considered lows versus that total area within the floodplain. We also looked at floodplain width. So not necessarily a heterogeneity metric strictly, but again, could also be influencing how water is moving through this corridor, and was also found to be important in our previous study. So we looked at the average width within each reach as another potential identifier of what could be causing this attenuation. So here on the top, we're just looking at these changes in magnitude compared to our different metrics. And on the bottom, we're looking at changes in lag time. And again, where we're seeing a higher heterogeneity, where we're seeing more attenuation is where the changes in magnitude are low, and where the changes in lag time are high. So low, more heterogeneity here, high, more heterogeneity or more attenuation here. On the x-axis, we have our different heterogeneity metrics. And so what we're really seeing is that changes in magnitude are associated with actual heterogeneity. So patch density, concavities, Shannon's evenness index. But what we're finding is that more attenuated peaks were happening with lower patchiness, fewer concavities, lower evenness. So actually lower heterogeneity was associated with that attenuation, which we thought was kind of interesting, not quite what we expected. When it came to lag time, the actual heterogeneity metrics didn't really seem to matter, and it was just purely floodplain width, which was influencing sort of the speed at which this wave can move through the river corridor and influencing our lag time. So to dive a little bit more into what that low heterogeneity, higher attenuation might need. We actually went out and we looked back at what are the units that we're seeing? Where are we seeing a lot of this attenuation? What does that heterogeneity actually look like? What we found is that in these lower patchiness, lower evenness reaches, that just means, right, more area is going to be in one specific unit. And these units on the Otter Creek, it was really these flat, low-lying patches that were very homogeneous, but very flat. And so that led to a lot of attenuation. Those were areas of good storage or high storage within this floodplain. So we're actually seeing that if you're just able to have sort of that low, flat patches, potentially we can get more attenuation. We actually saw that reaches that had a higher heterogeneity often had more of those floodplain channels, and those are places of conveyance. So when we have high flows and water is actually able to get into a channel, channels are very efficient, and they can actually move water back into the main channel and amplify or cause less attenuation of that downstream peak. So we are seeing that this heterogeneity or this topography is influencing our attenuation, and we're able to actually identify this on Otter Creek. But right, this is only 74 kilometers out of a much larger data set of rivers that we have either in Vermont, or even nationally, or even globally. We think about trying to scale up, actually including floodplains within predictions of flood predictions. How can we possibly do that? You know, how can we actually identify where on the landscape floodplains might be influencing our hydrographs? So to look at this, I want to identify sort of a larger model. Some of you might be familiar. I see some familiar Vermont faces in the crowd. But the National Water Model is a large hydrologic model that helps predict flooding and predict stream flow at 2.7 million stream reaches across the United States. And in order to do this, we have to really simplify things. And one of the things that we're simplifying is the topography that we're assuming within our river corridors. So as we go throughout even just some spaces here in Vermont, we can see some large changes, large differences in our river corridor topography. Sometimes we have really wide floodplains, sometimes they're fairly narrow. What's important to note here is that both of these are roughly the same drainage area, about 150 square kilometers. So it's not necessarily just a drainage area issue. We do just see this heterogeneity across the landscape. However, in these large-scale hydrologic models that we're using for flood prediction, we often model the channel as being the same across these different locations. So this black channel that's shown up here is the compound channel that would be used in the National Water Model at these reaches. And that's just identified as having a bankful width that's created from regional regressions. And then the floodplain would just be 3 times that bankful width. So sort of this prescribed cross-section that we give everywhere. In some places, this might actually work fairly well. But in others, it's obviously under predicting what we actually see as far as the floodplain. As our models are improving and as we're being able to model more and more complex things, even at large scales, there is the potential to include more complex floodplain topography. However, in order to include that complex floodplain topography, we first want to make sure that it matters. Would it actually matter for flood prediction at this watershed or at this regional scale? And so we were interested in really answering kind of 2 sub-questions of that. If we include floodplain cross-sections, even among a really simple routing model, so a model that's not necessarily getting all the physics of how water is moving through a reach, but if we're just able to swap in better topography, do we see changes in the output at that reach scale? And at the watershed scale, do we actually see improvement at our gauge locations? Are we able to better predict flooding at locations on the landscape where we actually know the discharge that we have? So again, still up in the Northeast for this one, we looked at a case study in Lake Champlain, looking at a number of different basins with over 800 reaches. So we're here kind of trying to scale up to this larger ability of looking at floodplains across the landscape. And so we wanted to route known floods through these 6 different watersheds and through these reaches using 2 different topographies. One being that simple National Water Model topography, and the other being a reached average topography that we just grabbed from DEMs. And then again, just routing water, moving water numerically through these reaches to see what the impact is at the reach and watershed scale. So to do that, we picked sort of a couple of key floods that occurred in each one of these watersheds. So for each watershed, we select 2 large to moderate floods. Particularly in this region, we get basin-wide floods. So if it's flooding in the headwaters, we often also see flooding downstream and vice versa. So it's kind of nice. We get sort of this even flood felt across the watershed. We then downloaded sort of inputs to our hydrologic model using this National Water Model retrospective hydro. So that is essentially, we didn't create our own rainfall runoff model. We're only interested in the routing of water through the river corridor. So we got these inputs from the National Water Model, whatever the hydrology they say, we'll use it. And then we're just interested in how that floodplain topography is actually influencing the routing through the river corridor. So we did this at the reach scale, again, using very simple physics. I won't get into it too much, but this just essentially assumes that we just have 1D flow, very simplifying assumptions there. And we ran the same hydrographs through each reach using, again, those two topographies, the National Water Model compound channel and then our full topography. What we found at the reach scale is that this full topography really decreased our celerity. That's the rate at which, the speed at which that flood wave is moving downstream. So that can significantly impact our lag time. Here we're seeing sort of that full topography minus the full model minus that National Water Model. So anywhere where we have sort of a decrease in that celerity means that the celerity in our full model is just lower. We have a lower speed of that flood wave in our floodplain model compared to the National Water Model. Overall, we saw that that floodplain model does decrease that celerity, and it's driven by some of these floodplain metrics. So in particular, floodplain width, the floodplain axis stage, and the drainage area, where we saw that wide floodplains resulted in larger decreases in celerity, more accessible or more well-connected floodplains also resulted in that decrease in celerity, and then larger drainage basins. So we can think about sort of these large floodplain rivers, have well-connected floodplains as being places where we're seeing that decrease in speed of the wave. So really kind of changing our lag time of these floods. Now, when we look at the actual magnitude of the floods, here we're looking at that change in discharge between our full topography model and the National Water Model. Those changes are much smaller, kind of on the order of 5 to 10% change in magnitude. But even though they're fairly small, they can really add up across the landscape. And where we're finding that these were largest were actually in reaches with narrow floodplains, high channel slopes, and low drainage areas, where we see the greatest percent attenuation of discharge. So we actually associated those with our headwaters. We're finding that the actual magnitude of flooding is changing the most, the actual discharge is changing the most in our headwaters. And so if we're not modeling the river corridor geometry and the headwaters right, we're actually missing a lot. And this is pretty significant for particularly the National Water Model, because we kind of thought that we were getting the geometry right in the headwaters. We thought that potentially there's not very much floodplain there. And so potentially that compound cross-section would do a pretty good job. But again, we're finding those biggest differences in headwaters. Even there, we're not getting it right with this simplified topography. So how does this actually scale up to the watershed scale? How does this actually influence our prediction as you can kind of compare to the discharge at the gauges? So to do that, we just took our reach scale model and we just connected it. So we sequentially routed flow from the headwaters downstream, again, sort of deriving those boundary conditions from the National Water Model retrospective. So not creating our own rainfall runoff model, providing that data and then just saying route downstream, keep flowing. And then at each of these gauge locations, we can then compare the hydrograph from our full model, the hydrograph from the National Water Model, as well as the hydrograph from those USGS gauges. So we looked at a couple of different metrics for error. We wanted to get information about how well are we matching the hydrograph shape, how well are we matching the hydrograph magnitude, how well are we matching the hydrograph variability, the streamflow variability. And then we have this catch-all parameter, or Klein-Gupta efficiency, or KGE, kind of captures all of these different elements of the hydrograph, trying to see how well we're matching those. Just to start off and to kind of prepare you for those next results, some places we did not see improvement. So here, the USGS gauges, or the observed hydrograph, is always in that dark gray color. Sometimes our full topography model was actually worse than the National Water Model. And in other basins, we got much closer to that actual observed hydrograph. In particular, this is actually Otter Creek again. And we're seeing with that floodplain model, we're able to better predict and better match the observed hydrograph. So what does this mean for our actual error metrics? Overall, we found pretty similar error between our two models. If we're just comparing simply what are all the values we get for the National Water Model versus our full topography model, there's not very many significant differences in error. However, we did find that particularly for these outliers, places where the national water model is doing particularly poorly, we see improvements. And so potentially that is showing us the influence of floodplains. In places where the national water model is really not getting it, are places where we're seeing floodplain influence. Another thing to note is that we also largely found that the full topography model improved predictions in places where the national water model is currently over predicting that flood peak. So here we have the national water model with a peak magnitude way above what was actually observed in the USGS gauge. In those cases, we actually saw a lot of improvement by using our floodplain model. And that's kind of intuitive, right? Floodplains are known to attenuate. So if we include them within our model, we can expect that to produce a more attenuated hydrograph. So in places where we have that over prediction, we actually see that our error metrics are improved 75% of the time. So much higher success rate with our full topography model. However, in places where the national water model is currently under predicting the peak, again, more attenuation isn't going to help with that flood prediction. It actually produces sort of a worse output. So that's sort of telling us that that might be more of an issue with the inputs to the model itself. Maybe we're not getting precipitation right. Maybe we're not getting some other forcings of the model correct. Whereas on the left-hand side, maybe this is an issue with river routing and floodplains. Particularly in places like this, which again is back in Vermont, flooding in July of 2023, on places where we see these really large floodplains, if we're able to get the precipitation right, being able to model those floodplains and how water is moving through those floodplains, even in a fairly simplified way, can really improve our predictions. So just to kind of summarize and wanting to check some of our intuitions, starting off with sort of what drives that heterogeneity, we really found that these wider river corridors were more heterogeneous, particularly in these non-perennial river corridors. We also found kind of something that was against what we were expecting, where those homogeneous reaches were better at attenuating flood flows. That was because they're sort of this place where we see more of those flat floodplains. So potentially more emphasis on certain unit types rather than the actual general heterogeneity that we're seeing. We also are finding that incorporating that floodplain topography can improve routing models, particularly in places where we're getting potentially that forcing, that precipitation correct, and in places where we're seeing that over prediction of flood peaks, which might be telling us that we're not necessarily capturing the effect of topography on how water is moving throughout the landscape. So there's a lot more directions we can go with this. I know I've talked a lot about water today, but as a geomorphologist, I'm also interested in how this heterogeneity is potentially influencing other watershed functions. So some of the other things that we're also looking at is how is this influencing sediment storage on the floodplains? How could this potentially be influencing organic matter storage? And also how it's potentially changing through time and what that means for storage in the long term. So there's a lot more questions. And if you have other ideas of how topography and heterogeneity might be influencing function, I'd love to hear them. But with that, I'll just thank you for your time and listening to me ramble about floodplains and why they matter. And I'd be happy to take any questions if you have them. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Infiltration could be a missing piece. Within the national water model, infiltration is mostly modeled within the rainfall runoff component. So something that we didn't quite touch, but out on the hill slopes, absolutely, they're trying to model infiltration. Hasn't really been considered as far as channel routing, just because, again, we're really using a very simplified model, sort of our most simple 1D model. So it doesn't really have the capacity to interact with groundwater within the river corridor. We consider that just like a bucket that's coming out of the rainfall runoff model and sort of the forcing model. I do think that that could be a cause of why the forcing data isn't right in some places, sort of not getting that infiltration right. But I think that that might be too complicated to add to the river corridor routing model, as far as they're already kind of concerned whether or not adding topography reach average topography is too complicated, but yeah. Of peak discharge. So that's the places where we're seeing, like, as a percentage of the incoming discharge, the largest change downstream. So those are able to actually attenuate discharge better than like some of those lowland areas. And part of the reason why is we think that, right, we see different incoming hydrographs in headwater streams. They tend to be a bit flashier. And that flashier hydrograph, just from the simple physics, those tend to attenuate more dramatically. So the incoming hydrograph also does matter. I didn't quite get into some of those like hydrograph parameters and how that influences it. But we think that part of that is why headwaters are actually pretty good as far as like percent of incoming discharge at attenuating. Their incoming discharge is also lower than some of these lowland floodplains. So that could be also another reason. But we do think that being able to accurately model the headwaters is really important for thinking about lowland flooding. Which has kind of been also suggested by a few other papers that have come out recently, sort of identifying these headwaters as a place we haven't really thought about flooding before, or being sort of this influence on flooding, but it could really be influencing sort of the amount of and the timing of water that we're getting, even far, far downstream. Yeah. Yeah, I can definitely speculate that, particularly for certain floodplains. Places where we saw invasive species like tamarisk, we found that those were actually a lot more homogeneous. So we kind of got one unit, and it was literally mostly the unit wherever we saw tamarisk, where they were kind of creating their own unit. So we did see units kind of forced homogeneity because of that invasive species. We less so with like some of the cottonwoods necessarily, but we did see sort of also sedimentary structures sort of immediately around those woody vegetation. And so kind of think that might also influence the way that these units are going to evolve through time, and might expect sort of more just variability in the topography within units that have woody vegetation compared to units that don't have woody vegetation. So kind of also thinking about change through time, which I didn't talk about much here, but I do think that the vegetation is going to impact it there as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I was looking for I was thinking about how
Yeah, so in the National Water Model, they do not distinguish between non-perennial and perennial in the routing model. They just kind of say like how much water is there. I will also say that for a lot of the watersheds in Vermont, we actually don't have any streams mapped as non-perennial in the NHD. And the National Water Model isn't necessarily using NHD high res, it's using the medium resolution, which is just an artifact of how we model hydrology at the national scale. So that also complicates things. They are trying within the National Water Model to incorporate this idea of non-perenniality, but mostly in more arid environments. So like the Southwest, like Utah, trying to say that this river should be able to go down to zero, which could also, again, influence how floods propagate, whether or not things are actually lighting up and flowing. But we haven't quite gotten into that. For streams that aren't mapped on the NHD, or streams that aren't mapped on the NHD medium resolution, theoretically, that is going to be captured within the rainfall runoff model in the NHD, or within the National Water Model. But just talking from folks who do work on the rainfall runoff model, they're also trying to figure out how to better model flow through some of these unmapped streams and non-perennial streams that might be not included within the channel routing model, but are included within that rainfall runoff model. It seems to be a sticking point, but maybe an area of future research.
Yeah, I know Chris was doing.
Cool. Yeah, I know that some of the work the National Water Model is run by NOAA and the USGS. But it's hard to kind of incorporate some of the finer scale stuff into the National Water Model. But I'll have to look for Chris's paper. Yeah.
I didn't take Geomorph 101. What got an external boundary condition?
Yeah, I mean, a little bit is right. It does increase slightly with drainage areas. So you just have larger rivers. You also tend to have larger floodplains. But particularly in sort of that intermediate space, so in between like the headwaters and like the Mississippi River, you can get a lot of variability within that floodplain width. So we can get both, again, narrow floodplains and wide floodplains at the same drainage area, as I was kind of showing in that second example. And the absolute width is thought to be driven by sort of underlying mythology. Could be things like bedrock fracture spacing, or even what your rock type is, which, you know, if you have softer rocks, you could potentially have wider floodplains forming. There are also some other suggestions that it could be related to the actual energy of flow and the need for flow dissipation, and sort of seeing regular intervals of wider floodplains forming because of that. In somewhat steep, moderate drainage areas, we tend to see what we call like beads on a string. And so we'll get these these reaches with narrow floodplains alternating with reaches with really wide floodplains and back into narrow and then back into wide. And that's sort of, again, an interplay between underlying mythology and potentially the need for energy dissipation. It's a good question. Yeah, we did look at gradient. Surprisingly, that one was not, gradient wasn't important. There was a number of things that fell out as not important, like the large wood, which we really thought that might be really influencing geomorphic heterogeneity, because we saw like units that were formed strictly because wood was there. That ended up like overall not being like a large correlation to the heterogeneity we were seeing. Slope also didn't seem to be a large correlation, which is kind of interesting because that relates to some metrics of like sediment transport. But yeah, we included slope, but it didn't come out as important. Yeah. Yeah. So when we were mapping geomorphic heterogeneity, there we were actually targeting unconfined river corridors, and those were all alluvial. When we're thinking about modeling at the landscape scale, and particularly in Vermont, we do have bedrock channels, but there we were just thinking about sort of what is the reached average topography. And so there you would kind of see a narrower river corridor, but not necessarily knowing whether it's bedrock or alluvium unless you kind of go out and actually look at that reach. But we do often see bedrock channels, particularly in the domain that we were modeling. They're just very narrow. We get really narrow river corridors in bedrock. Awesome. Thank you.